Hello YouTube. I am back again and I am speaking about sanctions this time. I've already spoken about democracy, about land reform and the economy, and I spoke about the different misconceptions regarding these different issues concerning Zimbabwe. And today I will speak about sanctions, and this is yet again another contentious issue. There are two schools of thought. One school of thought says there are no sanctions on Zimbabwe, and another school of thought says there are sanctions on Zimbabwe, and therefore it seems logical to me that there is some middle ground. One of the two schools of thought is, quite obviously false. And as you know, I am doing these videos to, in a sense, bring some, some middle ground in all this. And I am neither ZANU-PF or MDC. I am just a young Zimbabwean who is concerned about these issues. Nonetheless, I will begin by defining what sanctions are according to a dictionary I have. Sanction is to penalize, especially for violating a moral code or international law. And another definition is a coercive measure, usually adopted by several countries acting together against another country that is violating moral norms or international law. And just by the definitions, we already know whether Zimbabwe has or has no sanctions. Britain, Australia, Canada, the United States of America, and the European Union are probably the regions or countries that can slip off my tongue in the sense that these are the countries that actually created sanctions against Zimbabwe. Not against Zimbabwe as a country, but against officials in the government. So people like Robert Mugabe, people like Joyce Mujuru or Mnangagwa, and all those big people, even Gono, the minister, the Reserve Bank governor, are all under sanctions. Basically, what these countries did, these Western countries, they sat down and figured out which countries, which people in Zimbabwe are most closely linked to the brutal criminal regime of Robert Mugabe and ZANU-PF. And by sanctioning these people cannot travel out of Zimbabwe, they cannot have money outside Zimbabwe, or their bank accounts are frozen, their properties, etc. So these people are literally grounded. They cannot go to Europe unless if it's a United Nations mission, etc. Okay, looking at these sanctions, yes, truly these are sanctions against individuals, and these sanctions I was never against pre the consummation of the GNU, Government of National Unity. But today, when I look at these sanctions, again, I think that ZANU-PF is not completely repentant on the things that they may have done, and therefore some measure of these sanctions should be kept. So in other words, Mugabe shouldn't be allowed to travel to Europe as he pleases. Prime Minister Changirai can do the traveling to Europe if need be. The MDC side of the government can do that. And to be honest, I don't really mind those sanctions, to be honest. But there are sanctions that were imposed on the actual country. So the other sanctions I spoke about are sanctions against specific individuals in Zimbabwe who are believed to be the actual cause of the downfall of Zimbabwe. But when I look at other sanctions that are put in place by Western countries, I believe these sanctions are actually sanctions on Zimbabwe. In other words, these are coercive measures to penalize Zimbabwe to adopt a specific moral code. And one such measure is the most notorious, is the Zimbabwe Democracy Recovery Act, which is literally a law that was passed by the United States government. And this law basically says that the United States, in a sense, will advise its institutions. In other words, it is literally making illegal for its institutions to lend to Zimbabwe. For example, Zimbabwe, as we all know, is a very mineral-rich country. We have diamonds, gold, platinum, uranium, any resource you can really fathom, except for oil. But assuming the Bank of America wanted to invest in $1 million worth of stocks in a mining company in Zimbabwe, an obviously profitable mining company, they will not be able to do that because the law in the United States says that United States institutions cannot invest in Zimbabwe. It is similar to the laws placed against Cuba that Obama is just retracting as we speak. But these laws that you cannot even buy a Cuban cigar without breaking federal law. It is similar with Zimbabwe. You cannot even lend money to Zimbabwe if you're a United States institution without incurring these penalties. And we move on to the IMF and the World Bank. And as everyone knows, the IMF and the World Bank are American institutions in a sense. They are very, very much owned by the United States. This will change over time, especially after the financial crisis. China is coming in more. But nonetheless, the United States has such a big share. And no matter how much the Zimbabwean government will ask for aid, for example, after the GNU, the Zimbabwean government is asking for aid up to $1 billion. And there is actual change in Zimbabwe that we see. There are economic changes, the launch of the STEP program, and all these economic changes and policy changes. But thereafter, you still realize that the American government doesn't want to release money to Zimbabwe through the IMF because they have all the voting rights and they can veto anything. So the IMF went to Zimbabwe and they refused to give any money. And again, moving on, I believe there are other forms of sanctions, such as if you look at, let's say, bilateral trade agreements. They are literally non-existent with the United Kingdom and America anymore. And you really look at all these things where you realize that, yes, Zimbabwe does have targeted sanctions on specific individuals. But if you look at the sanctions that, for example, are placed in legal form in America, these sanctions are very, very bad for the country. I believe the United States is our third largest trading partner. And imagine if your third largest trading partner enforced such a law as the ZDRA that was passed by the United States. And thereafter, when Zimbabwe is asking for aid, these countries are refusing to give aid because they believe Zimbabwe has to change something, of which I believe Zimbabwe has really done. Zimbabwe is not perfect yet. We're moving towards some sort of a goal where we want to be a democracy. We're looking forward to elections in 2 years. But as our Prime Minister said, if the West does not release the funds expediently, Zimbabwe will collapse in the next 2 or 3 months. And even with such words from our Prime Minister, the United Kingdom and the United States do not care. They would rather fund Pakistan, they would rather fund Israel with tens of billions of dollars to massacre people in the Middle East. And they would rather fund the Saudi Arabian government, which is an absolute monarchy. They would rather smile at King Mswati. They would rather do all these abhorrent things than just release aid to Zimbabwe. And you look at things like cholera that occurred last year where 4,000 people died. Yes, it is attributed to Mugabe, but I point a finger elsewhere. I say, yes, Mugabe does have a part to play. But at the end of everything, you realize that if the West had actually pumped out enough money, cholera would have never happened. And I think in future I will do a video about aid, on whether Africa needs aid, on why the West needs to give aid to Africa, and all that kind of stuff, because it seems like I am making it seem as if we deserve the aid and the West needs to give us this aid. But anyway, these are the things that I noticed about Zimbabwe and the misconceptions people have. Zimbabwe is under sanctions, whether we like it or not. Thank you.